guilty, as Mr. Peterson was in this case, then the same jury decides on death penalty.
What does it take to reopen a case the entire world believes is closed? How does a man convicted of murdering his pregnant wife, sentenced to die, and condemned by an entire nation end up back in a courtroom more than 2 decades later, with a team of innocence lawyers insisting the evidence points somewhere else entirely? And if the jury got it right in 2004, why did a judge in April of 2026 have to reject 14 separate claims arguing that everything you think you know about this case is built on sand? On Christmas Eve of 2002, a 27-year-old mother-to-be vanished from her home in Modesto, California. Her nursery was ready. Her son already had a name. 4 months later, the waters of San Francisco Bay surrendered 2 bodies, and the husband who claimed he had spent that morning fishing alone was arrested near the Mexican border with dyed hair, thousands in cash, and his brother's identification riding beside his own. The country made up its mind before the trial even began. But here is what most people have never heard. 11 witnesses told police they saw a pregnant woman walking a dog through that neighborhood after her husband had already driven away. A home directly across the street was burglarized, and defense lawyers now allege the jury was told it happened on the wrong day. A van burned less than a mile from the house the following morning, and inside it, investigators found a mattress that would become the center of a fight over DNA testing still raging today. None of this changed the verdict. All of it is now sitting in front of California's higher courts. Was Scott Peterson a killer who nearly escaped, or a man convicted by his own demeanor while the real answer slipped past everyone? The prosecutors say one thing, his lawyers say another. The truth is buried in a case file most channels have never actually opened. And tonight, piece by piece, I'm going to open it for you, because nobody else is going to walk you through both sides of this, the way True Crime Vic will. Before we descend into that Christmas Eve, do me one favor. Tap the like button so this investigation reaches the people still arguing about this case. And subscribe to True Crime Vic, because the second part of this story, the part where the so-called new evidence gets torn open claim by claim, is coming, and you do not want to miss where it leads. A quick note before we begin. This case involves the death of an expectant mother and her unborn child. Nothing graphic will be described, but the subject matter is heavy, so take care of yourself as we move through it. To understand why this case refuses to die, you have to go back to who these 2 people were before the world ever learned their names. Lacey Denise Rocha grew up in Modesto, California, surrounded by a close, devoted family. Friends remembered her as warm, organized, and endlessly social, the kind of woman who planned dinners weeks in advance and lit up every room she entered. She had studied ornamental horticulture at California Polytechnic State University, loved gardening and cooking, and carried a smile so distinctive that it would soon appear on flyers taped to storefronts across an entire state. By December of 2002, she was 27 years old, working as a substitute teacher, and 8 months pregnant with her first child. Her due date was February 10th. She and her husband had already chosen a name for the boy she was carrying, Connor. The nursery in their home on Covena Avenue was nearly finished, decorated in a nautical theme, waiting for him. Her husband was Scott Peterson, 30 years old, a fertilizer salesman raised in San Diego. The 2 had met in the mid-90s in the San Luis Obispo area, where Scott worked at a cafe, and they married in 1997. To neighbors and relatives, they appeared settled and content, a young couple building exactly the life they had planned. Lacey's family adored him. What none of them knew was that 6 weeks before Lacey disappeared, on November 20th of 2002, Scott had begun a relationship with a massage therapist from Fresno named Amber Frey. They were introduced through a mutual acquaintance who had been assured Scott was single. Frey believed she was dating an unattached man, with no complications and no history. Then, at a dinner on December 9th, according to her later trial testimony, Scott changed his story. He admitted he had been married and told her he had lost his wife. He spoke of facing the approaching holidays without her. When he said those words, Lacey was alive, at home, and 15 days away from vanishing. Fry had no idea who Scott Peterson really was until the missing person coverage exploded across the country. When she recognized the man on her television, she went to investigators herself on December 30th, and from that moment forward, she cooperated completely. Detectives asked her to keep talking to Scott by phone, while recorders captured every word. Those calls, made while he still believed his secret was intact, captured him spinning fresh fictions even as search teams combed the region for his wife, at one point speaking to Frey, as though he were travelling in Europe while he stood among the volunteers in Modesto. The recordings would later be played for a jury as proof of a man capable of sustained, elaborate deception, and prosecutors treated them as a window into his character during the very weeks he was publicly pleading for Lacey's safe return. Whatever else remains contested about this case, one fact is not. By Christmas Eve of 2002, Scott Peterson was living a double life. Now we come to the two dates everything else orbits around. December 23rd was the last day anyone in Lacey's circle confirmed seeing her alive. She spoke with her mother, Sharon Rocher, by phone that evening. It was an unremarkable day, and that ordinariness is precisely what makes what followed so haunting. That same night, around 10:15, something strange unfolded across the street. A neighbor answered a knock at his door and found a stranger asking for money, claiming a girlfriend was stranded in the foothills. That neighbor was Ricardo Cordova, then a public defender in Stanislaus County, and today a judge on its superior court. He was not the only resident approached with that identical story, and a white station wagon was noticed parked close to the Peterson home. Cordova would later say the encounter reminded him of a casing tactic he recognized from his years in criminal law, someone probing which houses were occupied and which residents were paying attention. At the time, it meant nothing. In hindsight, it has never stopped meaning something to those who question this case. The next morning, December 2004, is where Scott's account begins. He told police that he and Lacey were home together, that she was planning to walk their golden retriever, Mac Kenzie, and that around 9:30 he left to drive roughly 90 miles to the Berkeley Marina to fish alone from a boat he had recently purchased. He said his wife was alive in their house when he pulled away. At about 10:18 that morning, a neighbor named Karen Service found Mac Kenzie wandering the street outside the Peterson home, leash still attached, with no one holding it. She returned the dog to the backyard and thought little of it. Hours later, that small act of neighborly kindness became one of the most scrutinized moments in the entire investigation, because it helped fix a window of time that both the prosecution and the defense would fight over for decades. When Scott returned that afternoon, Lacey was gone. Her vehicle sat in the driveway. Her purse hung inside the house. By evening, after calls to family turned up nothing, police were formally notified, and a search for Lacey Peterson was underway before Christmas morning arrived. There is one more detail from that street, and it matters enormously to everything you will hear in Part 2. Directly across from the Petersons stood the home of the Medina family, who had left town that morning. Their house was burglarized. The jury at Scott's trial was told the break-in occurred on December 26th, 2 days after Lacey vanished, and two men, Stephen Todd and Donald Glenn Pierce, eventually pleaded guilty to that crime. Both were interviewed by police. Both denied any connection to Lacey, and neither has ever been charged in her disappearance or death. They are, and must be regarded as, uninvolved in her case under the law. But the Los Angeles Innocence Project now alleges, in court filings, that the burglary actually happened on December 24th itself, the very day she disappeared, and that the jury never knew it. Prosecutors dispute that claim, and have long maintained the break-in had nothing to do with her fate. Hold that dispute in your mind. We will return to it. What followed December 24th became one of the largest missing person efforts Northern California had seen in years. Thousands of volunteers papered the region with flyers. Search teams swept parks, fields, and waterways around Modesto. A reward that started at $25,000 climbed to $500,000. Sharon Rocha stood before cameras and begged for her daughter's return. The story leapt from local bulletins to national broadcasts within days, and soon cable networks were dissecting every development in real time, transforming a Central Valley disappearance into one of the most covered cases in the country. Candlelight vigils drew crowds. Strangers drove in from other states to join the effort. For 4 agonizing months, despite all of it, there was nothing. From the earliest hours, though, detectives noticed something about the husband. Officers who spoke with Scott that first night described a composure they found unusual, a man who did not press them with the desperate questions they expected from a frantic spouse. In televised interviews over the following weeks, that same flat calm was there for the entire country to see. I am not going to tell you what his demeanor meant. Honest investigators could not agree on it then, and honest observers cannot agree on it now. What is beyond argument is that it shaped how police, the media, and eventually a jury interpreted every other move he made, and it began before a single piece of physical evidence existed. One more event from that week went almost unnoticed at the time. On the morning of December 25th, in Modesto's airport district, less than a mile from the Peterson home, a van was deliberately set on fire. Firefighters extinguished it. A report was filed, and the incident faded into the background noise of a city consumed by a missing mother. 2 decades later, defense lawyers would allege that inside that vehicle sat a mattress bearing apparent bloodstains, that it tested presumptively positive for blood, and that the DNA recovered from it has never been subjected to modern, more precise testing. Prosecutors have resisted those characterizations and fought the testing requests. In the winter of 2002, however, nobody connected a burning van to a vanished woman. Whether anyone should have is now a question sitting before California's courts. Then came April of 2003, and the Bay finally answered. On April 13th, a couple walking their dog along the Richmond shoreline of San Francisco Bay discovered the remains of a male fetus washed onto the rocks of a regional park. The following day, roughly a mile away, the remains of a woman were found along that same stretch of coast. Out of respect, I will not describe their condition. Within days, DNA confirmed what an entire nation had dreaded. Lacey Peterson and her son, Connor, had been found, not far from the marina where Scott said he had gone fishing on the morning his wife disappeared. 4 days later, on April 18th, officers arrested Scott Peterson in the parking lot of the Torrey Pines golf course in La Jolla, where he had told relatives he was meeting his father and brother for a round. La Jolla was no random location. It was where he had grown up, where his parents still lived, and where he knew every road, including the ones running south toward Mexico. A familiarity detectives cited when explaining why they believed he might be preparing to flee. What they inventoried from his vehicle dominated headlines for weeks. Nearly $15,000 in cash, 4 cell phones, camping and survival equipment, several knives, a shovel, his brother's identification tucked alongside his own driver's license. And the man himself looked different. His naturally dark hair had been dyed blonde, and he had grown a goatee. Scott offered explanations for all of it. He said the money came from his mother, that the appearance change was innocent, that he had no intention of running. Detectives who had spent 4 months watching him saw a man assembling an exit. A jury would eventually be asked to choose between those 2 readings, and you already know which one they chose. He was charged with first-degree murder in the death of his wife and second-degree murder in the death of his unborn son. Prosecutors would argue at trial that he killed Lacey in their home, sometime between the night of the 23rd and the morning of the 24th, used the fishing trip as cover to place her body in the bay, and was motivated by his affair and a desire to escape the marriage and impending fatherhood. They pointed, among other things, to a life insurance policy on Lacey worth $250,000 taken out the year before. His defense countered that the policy was routine planning purchased for both spouses, that the case was built entirely on circumstance, and that not one piece of direct physical evidence tied him to a killing. After a trial stretching nearly 6 months in 2004, jurors convicted him on both counts, and in March of 2005, he was sentenced to death. That should have been the end. It was not even close. In August of 2020, the California Supreme Court overturned his death sentence, ruling that potential jurors had been improperly screened. And in December of 2021, he was resentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Then, in late 2023, an organization called the Los Angeles Innocence Project took over his defense, and everything accelerated. After more than a year of investigation, they filed a habeas petition asserting that Scott Peterson was wrongfully convicted on what they describe as false and outdated evidence. Their filings allege that 11 eyewitnesses reported seeing Lacey walking her dog after Scott had already left for the marina, and that those accounts were dismissed. They allege the Medina burglary was misstated for the jury. They allege police destroyed videotaped interviews with the burglars and discarded physical evidence before the defense could examine it. They point to hydrology modeling, built on technology unavailable at trial, which they say shows the bodies could not have drifted from Scott's fishing route to the shoreline where they were found, and instead points toward a different stretch of coast, one reachable by car. And they cite newer fetal development research they claim places Connor's death on a date when Scott was under constant police surveillance. Every one of those claims is contested. Prosecutors and the original investigators stand firmly behind the conviction and reject the allegations of misconduct. Lassie's family has never wavered, telling Scott at his resentencing that he is a remorseless killer, and their grief deserves to stand at the center of every conversation about this case. And in April of 2026, Judge Elizabeth Hill of the San Mateo County Superior Court denied the petition in full, finding its 14 claims procedurally barred, lacking merit, or both, without ordering a review of the new material. Within hours, the Innocence Project announced it would carry the fight to a higher court, where a separate petition alleging juror misconduct was already pending. So here is where we stand, in the summer of 2026, with a case that was supposed to be settled a generation ago. A man who once sat on death row now watches his lawyers argue that the tied science, the timeline, and the investigation itself were flawed from the beginning, while the officials who put him away insist that nothing filed in any courtroom has disturbed a single brick of the case they built. A conviction that has survived for over 20 years. A defense team insisting the science underneath it has collapsed. A judge who slammed the door. An appeal climbing toward the top of California's justice system. And 2 victims, a mother and the son she never got to hold, whose names must outlast every argument made in their absence. I am going to take you inside that 800-page petition, and inside the prosecution's answer to it, the drift modeling and the expert who built the original theory, the wiretapped phone calls with Amber Frey, word for word, the dog scent evidence that divided the courtroom, the mattress, the watch pawned a week after Lacey vanished, and the interview tapes that no longer exist. You will hear the strongest version of both cases, and then you will decide for yourself whether the police got it right, or whether the most infamous verdict in modern American history is standing on a foundation that is quietly cracking apart. If this breakdown gave you a clearer picture than the headlines ever have, hit that like button right now, and subscribe to True Crime Vic with notifications on, because part 2 is where the file truly comes apart. And this channel is the only place you will see it examined from every angle. Until then, remember Lacey, remember Connor. Some stories demand more than a verdict. They demand the whole truth. How do you convict a man of double murder when there is no crime scene, no cause of death, no blood, no tissue, not a single forensic trace connecting him to the killing anywhere investigators looked? How does a jury send someone to death row on a case built almost entirely on circumstance? And how does that same emptiness, 20 years later, become the sharpest weapon his lawyers now carry into California's highest courts? And here is the question that should unsettle you most. When the verdict finally came, it was delivered by a panel that had lost 2 of its members mid-deliberation, been rebuilt with alternates, and reached its decision within hours of sitting down together for the first time. In part 1, I walked you through the disappearance of Scott Peterson, the 4-month search, the discovery in San Francisco Bay, and the arrest of her husband near the roads leading to Mexico. Now we go somewhere most coverage never takes you. Inside the courtroom itself, exhibit by exhibit, witness by witness, into the cross-examinations where expert opinions crumbled in real time, and then forward into the innocence petition that a judge threw out just months ago, in April of 2026, a ruling being appealed as I speak. By the end, you will understand exactly what convicted Scott Peterson, exactly what his lawyers say should unconvict him, and why neither side has ever been able to close this file for good. Nobody else is laying both cases on the table like this, because this is what True Crime Vic was built for. If you came here from part 1, thank you for trusting me with the rest of it. Take a second to hit the like button so this reaches everyone still debating this verdict, and subscribe to True Crime Vic, because the cases we open on this channel do not get closed anywhere else. The same note applies as before. This story concerns the deaths of a young mother and her unborn son. Nothing graphic follows, but the weight of it is real. So pace yourself accordingly. The prosecution's theory was brutally simple. Scott killed Lacey inside their home, sometime between the night of December 23rd and the morning of the 24th, then used a solitary fishing trip as cover to place her in the bay. They never claimed to know the exact method or moment. Legally, they did not have to. What they had to do was assemble enough circumstance to make any other explanation feel impossible. So let's examine what they actually brought. Start with a single strand of hair, recovered from a pair of pliers aboard Scott's 14-foot aluminum boat. Testing indicated it was consistent with Lacey's, and prosecutors presented it as proof she had been on a vessel she supposedly never knew existed, except she had been near it. Testimony established that Lacey visited the warehouse where the boat was stored in the days before she vanished. Meaning a solitary hair in a place she was independently known to have entered carried far less force than it first appeared to, and the claim that the boat was a secret from her collapsed entirely. Evidence at trial showed Lacey knew about the purchase, a correction that quietly removed one of the earliest pillars of the deception narrative, even as the impression it created lingered over everything. Then came the dog. 4 days after Lacey was reported missing, a trained trailing canine named Trimble was brought to the Berkeley Marina by handler Eloise Anderson of the Contra Costa County Search and Rescue Team. Given Lacey's scent, the animal reportedly tracked from the parking area to a pier near the water, close to where Scott said he launched. Trimble was certified, and the prosecution presented the alert as evidence Lacey's body had passed through that marina. The defense attacked the foundation underneath it. The scent articles came from inside the Peterson home, items belonging to a woman who shared every room with the very man under suspicion, and no procedure had first excluded his scent from the sample. Analysts who have studied this case in the years since remain divided, some calling the marina alert legitimate and corroborated, others insisting the contamination risk alone should have kept it away from a jury. It went to the jury anyway. There was concrete, too. Inside Scott's warehouse, detectives found cement residue on the boat trailer and circular voids in the dust suggesting containers had once sat there. Prosecutors argued he had manufactured multiple homemade anchors and that the missing ones went into the bay attached to his wife. Only a single anchor was ever recovered. When the state's own analyst compared cement from the Peterson driveway against the anchor material, he described the samples as inconsistent, then acknowledged, under questioning, that the sole meaningful difference was larger gravel in the driveway mix. Gravel, the defense argued, had simply been part of the original pour. The prosecution reframed the dispute as another lie about where leftover material had gone. The defense called it an innocent discrepancy dressed up as guilt. Timing was everything. And for timing, the state called Dr. Gregory DeVore, a maternal fetal medicine specialist who used bone measurements from Connor's remains to estimate when the pregnancy stopped progressing. His conclusion landed on December 20th to 3rd or 24th, the precise window the prosecution needed. That methodology has been contested from the day he stepped off the stand, with critics arguing the measurements could not support that degree of precision. And it now sits at the center of the modern innocence claims, which we will reach shortly. The state also had to explain geography, because the bodies surfaced miles from Scott's stated fishing route. For that, they called Dr. Ralph Cheng, a hydrologist with the United States Geological Survey, who modeled the tides and currents of the bay, and told jurors that Connor's body most likely entered the water in the vicinity of Brooks Island, near where Scott had been. But listen carefully to what Cheng conceded. He could build a confident drift model only for the smaller, lighter body. He could not reconstruct a reliable path for Lassie at all, and when pressed on whether he could pinpoint an entry location with real precision, he admitted he could not. Keep that admission in your pocket. 2 decades later, it becomes a doorway. And through all of it, this remained true. Searches of the house, the truck, the boat, and the warehouse produced no blood evidence of a killing, no tissue, nothing forensic tying Scott to the act itself. For a theory holding that a woman died inside her own home, that silence was deafening, and the defense never let the jury forget it. What the prosecution poured into that vacuum was character, and its purest form arrived through a telephone. You'll remember from part 1 that Amber Frey went to police within a week of the disappearance and agreed to record her calls with Scott. Jurors heard hours of them. A husband whose pregnant wife was missing, romancing another woman, fabricating an international trip, describing a future together, all while cameras filmed him at vigils. None of it proved murder. All of it answered the question the physical evidence could not, which was what kind of man was sitting at the defense table. Alongside the affair sat a $250,000 life insurance policy on Lacey, purchased the previous year, which prosecutors offered as financial motive, and the defense explained as ordinary planning arranged for both spouses at the same time. Between the recordings, the policy, and the composure detectives had described since night 1, the state gave jurors a portrait, and portraits can be more persuasive than fingerprints. Now the other side of the courtroom. Defense attorney Mark Garagos built his case on arithmetic. Scott's documented morning involved leaving home, driving across town to the warehouse, sending a work email, hitching the boat, towing it roughly 90 miles, buying a launch ticket, and putting a vessel in the water, where strangers with no stake in the outcome recalled seeing an unremarkable man doing unremarkable things. Stack those movements against the narrow window the prosecution proposed, Garagos argued, and there simply was not room for a murder and a concealment to have happened first. Then the defense reached for its own medical expert, and what followed became one of the most damaging sequences of the entire trial. For them, Dr. Charles March, accepted by the court as an authority in fertility and reproductive medicine, reviewed the same fetal measurements alongside Lacey's medical records, and testified that Connor could not have died before December 29th at the earliest, days after Lassie was already gone. If believed, that single opinion demolished the state's timeline, because it meant the child was alive long after his father was under constant observation. It was not believed. Under cross-examination, March's calculation was traced back to an assumption that Lacey learned of her pregnancy through a home test on a specific June date, a date that appeared nowhere in her medical file. He had inferred it. Pressed on the stand, visibly shaken, he conceded that a load-bearing element of his opinion rested on guesswork rather than any documented record, and courtroom. Observers described the moment as a catastrophe for the defense, their promised timeline witness dismantling his own credibility in front of the panel deciding Scott's life. The defense had one more thread, and it required no expert at all: the burglary. Directly across the street, the Medina home had been ransacked, and two men, Stephen Todd and Donald Glenn Pierce, were eventually arrested and pleaded guilty. Let me be unambiguous about them, as I was in Part 1. Both denied any connection to Lacey. Neither has ever been charged in her disappearance or death, and the law regards them as uninvolved in her case. What the defense argued in 2004 was about dates, not guilt. Police told the jury the break-in happened on December 26th, 2 days after Lacey vanished, rendering it irrelevant. The defense pointed to indications it happened on the 24th itself, which would place strangers on that street at the worst possible moment. Layered on top were the details you already know from Part 1. The late-night doorstep encounter witnessed by future Judge Ricardo Cordova, the repeated stranger asking for money, the station wagon parked nearby. All of it feeding a broader accusation that investigators fixed on the husband within hours and stopped genuinely chasing anything else. Which brings us to the sightings, and the record here deserves your full attention. In the days after the disappearance, at least a dozen callers contacted the Modesto tip line reporting a pregnant woman, in some accounts walking a dog matching Mac Kenzie, moving through that neighborhood on the morning of December 24th. Several descriptions were consistent with one another, and consistent with a route leading back toward her own block around 10 o'clock. The follow-up was thin. Contact came by phone, in some instances not at all, and detectives would later testify that no credible eyewitness accounts of Lacey existed after Scott's departure. Hold that testimony in your mind, because the current petition names it directly and calls it false, an allegation prosecutors reject. If even one of those callers saw what they believed they saw, the state's timeline could not survive it. The jury either never weighed those accounts or never believed them. After roughly 5 months, more than 170 witnesses, and a mountain of contested circumstance, deliberations began, and they were anything but smooth. Days in, juror Francis Gorman was removed for conducting outside research, replaced by an alternate named Richelle Nice. Remember her name. Then, in the final stretch, the foreperson himself was dismissed amid reported friction inside the room and his own request to step away, replaced by a second alternate over strenuous defense objection. The reconstituted panel, which had never deliberated as a group before that morning, returned within hours. Guilty of first-degree murder for Lacey. Guilty of second-degree murder for Connor. In March of 2005, Judge Alfred DeLucci imposed a sentence of death. If the courtroom half of this story gripped you, this is the moment to act on it. Like this video so it finds the people who only ever heard the headline, and subscribe to True Crime Vic. Because what happened after that death sentence is where this case transforms completely, and it is all still unfolding right now. For 15 years, the sentence stood. In August of 2020, the California Supreme Court struck it down. And precision matters here, because this ruling is constantly misrepresented. The court did not declare Scott innocent and did not disturb the conviction. It found that prospective jurors had been improperly excused over general reservations about capital punishment, an error confined to jury selection. In December of 2021, he was resentenced to life without parole, and in 2022 he was transferred from San Quentin to Mule Creek State Prison, where he remains. That should have been the final page. Instead, the Los Angeles Innocence Project entered the case, an organization affiliated with California State University, Los Angeles, separate from the national group sharing part of its name, and known for accepting clients only when its screening identifies a credible claim of actual innocence. Its lawyers spent over a year investigating, then filed the petition whose pillars I promised you in part 1. Here they are, each one an allegation, each one contested. Updated hydrodynamic modeling of the bay, built on tidal data and computing power unavailable in 2004, which the petition says proves the bodies could not have drifted from Scott's fishing area to the recovery shoreline, and points instead toward waters off the Albany Bulb, a peninsula reachable by car and on foot. No boat required. This is where Chang's old admission becomes a doorway, because a model he acknowledged he could not complete is precisely what the new experts claim to have finished, with a different answer. A revised medical analysis, placing Connor's death between December 28th and early January, squarely contradicting Devore's window, during a period when Scott was under heavy surveillance. Sworn statements from 11 witnesses describing Lacey walking the dog after Scott had driven away, accounts the petition says were ignored and then denied under oath. Evidence, the lawyers allege, that the Medina burglary occurred on December 24th and that the jury was told the wrong date, a claim that a witness overheard the burglars discussing Lacey confronting them. And most seriously, allegations that in May of 2003, shortly after Scott's arraignment, videotaped interviews with the burglary suspects were destroyed the day after investigators met to discuss producing them, and that the stolen safe was discarded before anyone examined it forensically. There is more. A watch resembling Lacey's, pawned a week after she vanished. A van deliberately torched near the home on Christmas morning, containing a mattress with apparent bloodstains that tested presumptively positive, carrying DNA that has never undergone modern analysis. In May of 2024, a judge permitted new testing on exactly one item, a strip of duct tape recovered from Lacey's clothing at autopsy, and denied everything else. Prosecutors and the original investigators dispute every claim you just heard. They maintain the burglary was resolved and unrelated, that the sightings were investigated and unsubstantiated, that the destruction allegations distort routine evidence handling, and that nothing filed in 20 years has weakened the verdict. Lacey's family has been steadfast, describing Scott at his resentencing as a remorseless killer, and their voice belongs at the center of this, not the margins. And in April of 2026, Judge Elizabeth Hill agreed with the state, denying the petition in full and rejecting all 14 claims as procedurally barred, without merit, or both, declining even to order a review of the new material. The defense immediately announced an appeal and a separate petition, alleging that juror Rochelle Nice concealed her own history on her questionnaire and denied Scott an impartial panel, is already pending before the California Supreme Court. A 2022 hearing found her answers false but unintentional and non-prejudicial. That finding is now under challenge. The juror drama from 2004 never ended. It just changed venues. So, what do we actually hold at the end of all this? A conviction with no confessed method, no crime scene, and no forensic trace, sustained for 2 decades by circumstance, recordings, and a demeanor an entire nation judged. A circumstantial prosecution asks jurors to do something no laboratory can validate. It asks them to interpret a human being, to decide what grief should look like, what guilt should look like, and to trust that the difference between them is visible to the naked eye. There is no scientific consensus that it is. That tension convicted Scott Peterson, and that same tension is what his lawyers are now carrying up the appellate ladder, arguing that a case resting this heavily on impressions deserves to have its actual proof retested with every tool that exists in 2026. I am not going to hand you a conclusion, because the honest answer is that the courts themselves have not finished writing one. He may be exactly what the jury decided he was. The petition may collapse at every level the way it collapsed in April, Or somewhere in that untested DNA, that unmodeled drift path, those unexamined sightings, there may be an answer nobody has been forced to confront. What Lacey and Connor are owed is not a comfortable narrative in either direction. They are owed evidence pushed to its absolute limit. And as of this recording, that has not happened yet. So now I want to hear from you. After walking through both files, the one that convicted him and the one fighting to unravel it, where do you stand? Put it in the comments, because I read them, and this case deserves the argument. If this two-part investigation gave you more than any headline ever has, hit that like button before you go, and subscribe to True Crime Vic. Notifications on, because when the appellate courts rule, and they will, this channel will take you inside that decision the same way we took you inside this one. Until then, keep asking the questions verdicts never quite answer. I will see you in the next case.